As I mentioned, we're going to look at the last chapter of 2 Corinthians, and then we're going to spend the last part of the class, however long we've got, to just kind of review and talk about the major themes that we talked about in this letter. As I said, this is really the deepest I've ever looked at and taught the book of 2 Corinthians. It always seems like you teach 1 Corinthians a lot more than 2 Corinthians. I don't know why it feels that way. But this has really been a very rewarding study for me. And I want to go back and look at the major things that this book, at least in my mind, have really just popped out at me in this study. Verse 1 starts with a theme that we've seen before. I mean, this is something Paul kind of reiterates, and there seems to be a reason why he's doing it. He again reminds him, this is the third time I'm going to be coming to you. Back in chapter 12, verse 14, he mentions that. In chapter 1, he doesn't describe it as the third time, but again, he emphasizes, I am coming to visit you. So one of the major themes or major purposes for this letter was simply to prepare them because Paul is going to be making a visit in person. But there are things that he wants to accomplish before he gets there, so that he doesn't have to do those things when he does get there. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go through. It really is, he's trying to deal with their behavior before he gets there. This is essentially the easy path he's giving them. And then if they don't choose the easy path, then there's going to be a more difficult path. Now, what's fascinating is, as soon as he tells them, this is the third time I'm coming to visit you, he immediately quotes from Deuteronomy. I don't think I wrote it down, but it's the old law that says that a fact is confirmed only by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Why would he immediately quote that after saying, this is the third time I'm coming to you? Yeah, apparently this, it seems to me he's almost saying that my third visit is going to be the third witness. Now, one commentator I was reading, and I respect him a lot, said, well, it still is just one witness. And that's true. But it does seem like Paul is saying, if this is the third trip that I make to visit there, and I'm still seeing the same behavior, this is not an isolated incident anymore. This has become a pattern. This has become a fact. The other commentator suggested the idea that this was Paul saying, I'm not going to listen to any reports, any complaints of behavior of anybody, saying, unless there's 2 or 3 witnesses. The problem I have with that is Paul is not coming to sit as a judge for them. In fact, he'd even said that in the first letter. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, he said, isn't there those among you that can sit as judges? You know, he said, it's your shame if there's nobody among you that can sit as a judge when people can't work out their issues themselves. So there's no indication in this context that Paul is intending to come there to kind of sit in tribunal, much like out in the Old West where you would have a circuit judge. I mean, that's where we had that phrase today in our legal system. A circuit judge was a judge who would make a circuit through different territories and sit in judgment of the various things that had occurred in those territories. Paul is not doing that. There's just no evidence of that at all. But he is emphasizing the fact that this behavior that he has seen before, he doesn't want to see it again. And he says, if I do, I'm going to have to deal with that, and I'm going to have to deal with it severely because it has to stop. It is divisive, and if it is divisive, then none of us can stand for that. That is an excellent point for us to take out of that. None of us are apostles, and we recognize that. It doesn't mean we're to be going to churches that have problems and start acting severely with them and straighten them out like an apostle would. But what we do take from that it should apply to every one of us, If there are people who are acting divisively in our number, we cannot tolerate that. We cannot tolerate divisive behavior. That doesn't mean everybody has to agree with me. That's not the way you deal with divisive behavior. Divisive behavior is an attitude. And that's what Paul is saying he's going to deal with, is that attitude of this divisive behavior. And so he tells them, I'm going to be strong if that is needed. Remember, that was one of the criticisms that was made of Paul. His personal presence is weak and unimpressive. And as we talked about, that was by intent. Paul was not there to oppress them by the presentation of Paul. Paul was there to present the message of the gospel. And he was there to demonstrate the behavior of Jesus as well as the words of Jesus. So the criticism was, his letters are strong, but his personal presence is unimpressive. It's weak. Well, Paul says, if you're looking for strength and you force me to do that, I will. But he doesn't want to. It's kind of like what we talked about the last couple of weeks, where the boasting is something, I don't want to do it. You're forcing me to do it. And he's saying, if you're forcing me to be severe and strong with you, then I will do that if necessary, but he didn't want to. Notice he said, if need be, I will not spare anyone. He's going to address what needs to be addressed if they don't take care of that before he gets there. But notice verse 3. Since you're seeking for proof of the Christ who speaks in me, and who is not weak toward you, but mighty in you, for indeed he was crucified because of weakness. This is really the same criticism that was said about Jesus. Even at the trial of Jesus, what were the Jews and Pilate saying about Jesus during that trial? Yeah. They were essentially criticizing the weakness. He said, don't you say anything? Don't you respond in any way? Don't you know what I can do to you, Pilate said? Or even on the cross, as you just quoted, they're wagging their heads. They're mocking Jesus, saying, if you're truly who you say you are, come down from that cross, save yourself and save us. They were ridiculing him for his weakness. The same charges that are being made against Paul in Corinth. And yet, what's the opposite side of the crucifixion? He's resurrected in power. There is no greater power than the power over death. And Jesus demonstrated that power. And Paul is showing that that's what Jesus enables him to do. Enables him to be weak, but if necessary, will also enable him to be strong. So that really is the message of the crucifixion. The crucifixion is this message in microcosm. Sacrificing self out of what appears to be weakness, but in fact, it is strength. It is a decision, a choice that is made. I've often made that point about Jesus, is we never should look at Jesus on the cross as how he was forced to the cross. Jesus was in control to the moment he gave up his spirit. It wasn't taken from him. So that's how Paul starts this point. And then we get to verse 5, and this is one of those phrases we talked about at the very first class, some of the very common phrases that we find in 2 Corinthians that we use all the time. Test yourselves. That comes from chapter 13, verse 5. Paul says, test yourselves to see if you are in the faith, examine yourself. So he says it twice. He uses two different words here. Unfortunately, depending on which translation you have, they may be reversing the words in English. Some of the translations actually say, examine yourselves to see if you're in your faith, test yourselves. So you can see there's obviously a very close correlation between these two words in Greek. But let's talk just a little bit about the distinction. The one that is used first, regardless of whether your translation translates it as test or examine, the one that is used first is a challenge like a temptation. If you think back to what Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 10, where he talked about how the people were testing God when they were complaining in the wilderness, that's the idea here. So Paul says, challenge yourself. Look to see, am I in the faith? And I'm going to come back and talk about that phrase in the faith in just a moment. So the first part of it is challenge yourself. And then the second word, I guess the closest equivalent I could think of is, you remember when they had the gold rush out west and everybody was going out to Colorado and then later to California to find gold? Well, when you found gold, how did you know how much gold there was? You had to go what was called an assayist. And the assayist would examine that gold by weight, looking through a glass at it, to determine how pure that gold was. That's the idea of what Paul is talking about here. It's talking about examining it carefully to prove its value. And so Paul is telling them, you need to challenge yourself. You need to look at yourself closely. Look and see, am I really in the faith? Now, I've mentioned a couple of times in the class that I know very little about Greek, but one of the things that I've learned is in Greek, when they wanted to emphasize a particular thought, we will often put it in bold letters, or I'll say it really loud if I want you to understand that point. In Greek, they put that word first in the sentence. So whatever word comes first in the sentence, that is what the author is emphasizing. And the word that comes first in this sentence is yourselves. So what Paul is doing here is telling them, you need to examine yourself. And of course, that's in contrast to a theme that he talked about back in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, where they were judging everybody else, judging Paul. And he told them, said, I don't care what you judge me. It's not, God's not going to be listening to that. God's not going to be asking what you think. And I don't really care either. But what he is telling us here is we do need to be examining ourselves. Now, let me clarify that just a little bit. This is not an examination to say if I'm saved or not. It's an examination. Am I in the faith? That's the key. And let's talk about that. I want to spend just a little time talking about that. Those of you who are my age and been members of a Church of Christ, for most of your life, probably remember a book that was entitled Walking by Faith. I thought it was pretty much required for every local church to use that in adult Bible classes back in the 60s. And there's a lot of good stuff in that book. Don't misunderstand me. But the book is mistitled, in my opinion. Because what was called Walking by Faith was actually a series of doctrines. And it was explaining what the author thought was the biblical doctrine as opposed to what were often false doctrines. Is that what it means to be in the faith? And by the way, that phrase, walking by faith, comes from 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7. Paul says there, we walk by faith, not by sight. Well, I'm going to suggest to you that walking by faith is not making sure you're right on every doctrine. That is not what it means. In fact, if we go back to that context of 2 Corinthians 5, that's not the context at all. The context of 2 Corinthians 5 was actually talking about living for the world to come instead of living for the present world in which our bodies reside. But I would suggest to you the opposite extreme of that is also not what it means to be in the faith. Some people will argue, well, of course, being in the faith doesn't mean you got all the doctrines right. It just means you believe in God. Well, a non-functioning belief in God is not in the faith either. James talked about that in James chapter 2. The demons would be in the faith if that's what that meant. They believe in God. So what does it mean then? What am I supposed to be examining? What am I supposed to be testing myself to see if I am in the faith? Okay, I'll shut up for a while. I'm asking a question. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And it really is recognizing the source and putting your faith and confidence in the source. Again, it's not, do I have all the doctrines right? But you started with that very thought. This is the message of Jesus Christ. And so therefore, do I trust that message? Because I trust Christ. Anybody else with some thoughts or comments? Go ahead, Mike.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of also thing I've thought about before, and this is one of the things I've never really, when you talk about doing everything, we all know that best is never going to be good enough. And so you wind up in this situation where we seem to sort of default to, well, we do our best, and Christ covers the gap.
Hmm.
But when you look at the scripture, it talks about being transformed. That seems to be something a little bit more. In other words, it's not, transformation seems to be that it has to be more than just living what we've always lived, which is to try, but to fail, to try and have the blood of Christ cover us. That doesn't really seem like transformation. That seems just like kind of, well, we're just doing the way we always did, but now it's okay because it's Christ. And so, I'm not trying to change the subject, but it seems it's kind of goes along with it. To walk by faith. To me, if we walk by faith, then we should be a new creature. We should be transformed. We should have the mind of Christ. But I've never really figured out exactly what all those things mean. Mm-hmm.
I fully agree with you, and I absolutely love the way you started that, because I absolutely agree with you. Just simply saying, well, now I have an answer, but I don't do right. That's really not what being transformed is. But all those things that you just mentioned, having the mind of Christ, being transformed, being a new creature, again, all come from 2 Corinthians. And it is very much a mindset. It's not necessarily that our behavior suddenly gets better, but it's our mindset changes. And I think that's really the point that Paul is getting at, is having a different mindset, having different goals, having different aspirations. That's what changes. Go ahead, Joe.
I think God did transform.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Motivations prior to coming to Christ, prior to baptism, are all about yourself, all about, say, fleshly desires. Then, to me, at least part of the transformation is now my motivations are spiritual motivations. Mm-hmm. The reasons I do things now are not, again, ideally, all self-gratifying. They are to please the Lord.
Right.
They are to emulate Christ and to be that example. But again, those are all spiritual motivations now, as opposed to worldly or fleshly, whatever you want to call it, type motivation. So I think that's, again, at least part of what that transformation is supposed to be.
Yeah, again, I fully agree. Mhm. Yep. And I mentioned in chapter 5, I think that's important to put in the context because it's in the same letter that Paul wrote. When he makes that statement, for we walk by faith, not by sight. And maybe I should emphasize that first word, for we walk by faith, not by sight. It's what he said before that that really defines what it means to walk by faith. And as I mentioned, we're not going to take the time now, we just don't have it. But when you go back and look at the first part of chapter 5, that's where Paul talks about while we groan in this tent, longing to be clothed with the garment that is from heaven, that which is immortal instead of that which is mortal. That's very much that mindset. That's very much changing what are my aspirations, what are my goals, what am I trying to accomplish today and tomorrow and the next day. Far too often, we still get pulled back to thinking about, well, what I'm trying to accomplish today is do my checklist of all the things I need to, make sure I get all my bills paid, make sure I'm doing whatever I need to take care of my family, whatever I'm doing to entertain myself. Those are our checklists. But for one who has been transformed, who is a new creature, old things have passed away. The checklist for today is, what can I do in God's kingdom today? And I think ultimately that's what it means to walk by faith instead of walking by sight. What's sight? Bills, family, entertainment, all those other things. What's faith? The kingdom of our dear Lord. I can't see a physical representation of that. But with the eyes of faith, that should be all I see. And that fits very much in this context that Paul is talking about here when he says to challenge yourselves, test yourselves. It is to look and see that which is complete, that which is trustworthy. And ultimately, we need to live our lives for that which is worthy of our trust. And the only thing that is worthy of our trust is his kingdom. Jesus said it himself in the Sermon on the Mount. Seek first the kingdom of God. Seek first this kingdom, this righteousness. All the other things will be taken care of. God will take care of all the other things you need. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. And as we mentioned, Paul can be a little bit sarcastic. Notice what he says to them. Don't you recognize this about yourselves? That Christ is in you? Unless you fail the test? In fact, Paul's being a little sarcastic here. That is the failure condition. When you take a test, the teacher will tell you, well, you have to score at least 60% to pass, or 70%, whatever the ranking is. I remember when I took my driving test, it had to be 75%. I got 75%. So I got my driving test the first time through, barely. What's the failure condition here? You can't see Christ in yourself. So Paul's being a little sarcastic here. He's really defining to us, this is the failure condition. If you can't see Jesus in yourself, then you failed. That's what it means to walk by faith. Go ahead, Dave.
I think that's really significant because earlier in chapter 4, being transformed into the image of Christ.
Yes.
From 4 to all of that. I think that is part of what seems like a gray area that's hard to define for us sometimes, is that we are constantly being sanctified and transformed into the image of Christ. And as he says here at the end, if that's not in you, then fail the test.
Great analogy. And I should have made this point earlier. I'm glad you brought that up. Every one of these themes that Paul's talking about here are things that he's already talked about previously in the letter. This is what Paul does in his writing. When he concludes an idea, or in this case, concludes an entire letter, he will always go back and touch on the major things that he's discussed in detail. He's going to bring you back and remind you of those. All right, look at verse 7. I love what he says here. I don't want you to do anything wrong. Well, I think any preacher of God's word, that's got to be their goal. Yeah, you're not trying to teach people things just so they know. That what's the value in just teaching people knowledge that has no practical purpose? He said, I'm writing these things so that you do no wrong. The Apostle John wrote the same thing. 1 John chapter 2, verse 1. I write these things so that you will not sin. And then John says, but. And Paul is kind of essentially saying, but I know you will do wrong. And so what he's doing is trying to show them what it means to be in Jesus Christ. This goes back to what Mike was talking about earlier. We're trying to do that which is right. That absolutely is a part of Christianity. But also recognizing there's times where we will not. But that doesn't mean we justify it. That doesn't mean we welcome it. That doesn't mean we say, well, it's just okay. Recognize that the only reason it can be okay is what we just talked about, Jesus on the cross. That's the only time that it can be quote unquote okay. So Paul says, I write these things that you do no wrong. And he says, that's all I can do. Notice what he said here in verse 8. We can do nothing against the truth, but for the truth. Anyone who would try to say something that's not true has proven that they are not a speaker of God's word. Just as simple as it can possibly be. But then notice what he says here. Now, recognize weak is not the same thing as sinning. Verse 9, we rejoice when we ourselves are weak, but you are strong. Why? Why would Paul rejoice when he can be weak while they are strong? In fact, what has he been talking about through this entire letter is his goal, his personal goal for them, for that church in Corinth. What is he giving to them? We talked about this, was it last week? A child doesn't save up for their parent, but the parent for the child. What is he giving to them? The treasure of good news. Ultimately, he's giving himself. And of course, that's what that good news is. Because what did Jesus give us? Himself. Greater love has no man than what? Exactly. And I guess that's really a good way of saying it. He is giving himself to them for God, which is what Jesus did. Gave himself for us, but ultimately for God's purpose, that he could give the kingdom back to God. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very good point to make. It's not just the academic part of it. We saw this back in chapter 11 when Paul was talking about all the things that he'd gone through. Again, not bragging on himself, but he was stoned, he was shipwrecked, he was left for dead, he was beaten times without number. Essentially, what Paul is saying here is, I am spending myself, gladly so, because what's the result of that? They become strong. What parent would ever feel that same way about their children? I'm glad to give myself for my children. That's, again, that's what Paul is saying here. And obviously the message then is, it's kind of like what we talked about, that comfort thing. God comforts us so that what? What do we do when we are comforted by God? We comfort others. If Jesus has given himself to me, now what do? I give myself to others. And what ultimately is Paul challenging the church of Corinth and us to do? Keep doing that. Keep giving yourself to others. But he comes back to that thought. He says, I'm glad when I'm weak and you are strong. He said, I'm writing this letter, notice verse 10, while I'm absent, in order that when present, I may not use severity, in accordance with the authority which the Lord gave me. Notice here though, even when, if, and when he has to use severity, what's his motivation? To build up. I mentioned the fact that Paul always comes back to themes. Go back to chapter 10. That's where this section began. Chapter 10, verse 8. Even if I should boast somewhat further about our authority, which the Lord gave for building you up and not for destroying. Authority, edification. He started with that thought. He ends with that thought. This is why he has written this letter. All right, let me go very quickly through this. I'm just going to make a point on all of these that begin with the word be. Commentators are not sure whether this should be looked at in the passive voice or the active voice. Passive voice means something that you're allowing to be done to you. Active voice is something that you are doing. So like where it says be comforted, does that mean that I'm allowing God to comfort me, or does that mean I am comforting others? Or is it both? It very well could be both. It's certainly within the theme of what Paul talked about. As I receive comfort from God, I then in turn give comfort to others from that comfort that God gave us. But I want to get to this very last verse. It's the only time in Paul's epistles that you find these three concepts put together like this. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit. What great themes. We could spend an entire class, do an entire sermon, just talking about these three ideas together. But here Paul is showing that this is the work of the Trinity, the triune God. Is this grace, love, fellowship. Themes that we've been looking at in both epistles, from 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And it seems entirely appropriate Paul ends with that thought. All right, let me very quickly talk about the major themes that we've discussed as we've gone through our study. I began with the easiest one because I've had it on the chart every single week. This is how he began the letter, talking about Father of mercies, the God of all comforts. And that is the theme, if you would, of this entire epistle. Then we see where Paul talks about his anxiety. Why was he anxious? Anybody remember? What was he anxious about? I mean, he was so anxious that when he had an opportunity to serve in the kingdom in Troas, he walked away and went on to the next village, the next city. Why was he so anxious? Exactly. He was anxious about the condition of the church in Corinth. If we don't see how much he loved them from that, then we're not seeing anything. He was so worried about them that he even chose to walk away from an opportunity the Lord had given him in Troas. And he wanted them to understand how much he cared about them. And then we have what is called the Great Diversion. That's where he talked about the fact that he couldn't find Titus, and he finally got to Troas. And then what does he suddenly do? Chapter 2, I think it's verse 14, if I remember correctly. I mean, he's talking about his anxiety, then suddenly, what's he say? Praise be to God. What a dramatic shift. What caused him to do that? He heard the good news of what was going on in Corinth. All right, very quickly, the ministry. Remember, every single one of you has a ministry. You don't have a brand. You don't have to worry about a corporate headquarters, filing taxes, all that kind of stuff. But every one of us has a ministry. Treasure in earthen vessels. That phrase, I love it. Walking by faith, not by sight. Separation from this world. Those are the themes of what it means to be a Christian. And Paul went to them before he returns back to the church in Corinth, and then talks to them about practically what it means for them. Anybody got any thoughts or comments about what we've talked about? Anything that just jumps out about this letter that you want to bring out?